Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, Capital Markets Analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we've got Rena Sherbill. She is the Senior Editor with Seeking Alpha, as well as the host of the Cannabis Investing Podcast. Rena, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Yeah. So today we're going to jump into a top 10 list of marijuana stock news stories of the week, starting with number 10. All right, the COVID-19 is forcing analysts to reassess some pot stocks with recent ratings and price target updates. So the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the game for nearly every single cannabis company. So according to the Benzinga article, the response to the coronavirus, they have many analysts updating research on individual pot stocks in favor of the virus's impact, recapping analyst activity, including ratings and pricing targets. Have you seen a lot of downgrades recently, which should probably impact who can carry that? Pension funds, for example, I know that they have like sin clauses and they can't necessarily hold cannabis stocks, but downgrading, how do you think that's going to impact some of these companies? Are you seeing any fallout?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell at this point. We're definitely seeing some downgrades. We've seen some, announcements from MedMen with their they're not releasing their earnings guidance now. It looks like they might be in receivership from GGP. Kronos had some disappointing earnings. But then, analysts come out and they've liked some other stocks. So it's hard. We also saw from Acreage Holdings a bunch of layoffs. We've seen a ton of layoffs in the industry, which I think lends itself to the problem with the capital crunch. There was a problem before COVID. It's been exacerbated by COVID. I think now the analysts are starting to look at the balance sheets, look at how much cash, if there's a long lasting cash crunch, how much will that affect these stocks? Institutional investors, the money coming in, it's really a tough time. But at the same time, we're seeing companies like Curaleaf, reporting record revenue, have a great earnings release last week. Also, many dispensaries that are reporting record revenue within this. So I think that there's going to continue to be some downgrades as I think we see the shakeout play out that I think predated COVID. But as I said, COVID is exacerbating that. So I think we will continue to see it. I also think we might be surprised to see some upgrades. We have Trulieve releasing earnings this week. I'm interested to see what numbers they come out with. I'm also interested to see what analysts maybe pick up that stock as a buy, either pre or post earnings. I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going to be happening as a result of COVID. It's going to force a lot of companies to accelerate their revenue and profitability and reassess some of the valuations. I think we'll get into Curaleaf. I'm curious to pick your brain about that one a little bit because I have my own concerns. But I'm assuming they're in this list somewhere. So if we don't get to them, we'll talk about it at the very end.
Okay.
But number 9 on the list is that Aurora is a piece of crap, according to an analyst here. So there's many bargains out there.
Downgrades.
What's that?
Speaking of downgrades.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So apparently there's a lot of bargains out there, but this one analyst says that Aurora isn't with them. And so this analyst is with Acker. So Acker appeared on Acker appeared on Bloomberg recently and talked about Aurora Cannabis and his answer to whether or not this beaten down stock was a buy. And it was a resounding no. So Aurora is trading pennies on the dollar at this point, are they not?
Yeah. They're about at $1. Yeah. How the mighty have fallen, huh?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it looks really good day to day with percentage increases, but it doesn't really help when you're a penny stock. So,
right.
Yeah, that's
I think if you've got a high risk profile and you want to buy it low and you think they might have a way to work it out, it's definitely a perspective to take. I think, and look, they could also be, they have new management in. So definitely if you're playing devil's advocate, you could say they have new management. They're looking to be more fiscally responsible. They certainly did not really do that in the past year or so, which I think has led us to this place. I think there's a lot of issues in terms of how much debt they've already taken on, in terms of how that's been packaged. I don't know. I wouldn't call it a piece of crap, but I definitely wouldn't be long that stock right now. And I think if you are long, you probably already got in, or you might be looking to just get in at the very, very bottom. And if people are doing that, I wish them luck in that pursuit.
Yes, in the same way that when I'm at a craps table, I wish that person luck when they blow on their dice and throw it. And since Vegas is closed, what better way to gamble than on the
Right.
pot stocks? So I don't look at it as an investment. I do think it's a decent gambling play, especially since you can't do blackjack on the strip right now.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, if you got the money, let it burn.
Yeah.
Speaking of MedMen, they acquire exclusive licensing to 8 clinical trials of LSD. Not really going to focus too much on this, but MedMen, what's your take on REITs in general and multi-state operators that are heavily involved with commercial real estate? We're seeing some REITs taking a hit, potentially even losing everything. And so do you see like commercial real estate, if it drops a percentage or two, really bringing down some of these REITs and MSOs?
Another good question, and I think it might be too soon to tell exactly right now. I think you've seen some interesting numbers come out of IIPR. I think everybody was really bullish on that REIT in particular. I think because of how much real estate they've accumulated so far. It's interesting to see in terms of the real estate, like what is the economy going to be like in this year, in the next year? Will buying up all those properties, will that pay off? I don't know that answer. I'm not sure that many people do at this point. It's a really interesting place to be in the cannabis sector because, right, you're supposed to be being fiscally responsible right now. We've seen so many managements, change leadership because of that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the real thing was on expansion at all costs for so long. So people have really run into that issue, REITs in particular, because real estate obviously is a cash heavy business. But in terms of how much money is out there, what's going to be happening with those real estate plays, what's happening with retail in general, it's really I think it's really hard to say, especially with all this home delivery. Will people really be investing in all that real estate at this point? I think this year we're going to see some interesting things play out, and I think we're going to be surprised also at some of the maybe long-term effects that come from this period. I think because it's going to be a much longer period than maybe we all think it might be.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think maybe one of the biggest takeaways of this virus and the impacts is going to be people utilizing delivery or pre-order. So Washington State doesn't have delivery, but they're forcing or requiring that you pre-order, which doesn't include buying it, right? So you can't buy it online because that's federally illegal. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of pre-orders, and if delivery isn't an option in states like Washington, I think they'll probably implement that because of that reason. So yeah, maybe that's one of the biggest takeaways is the way that people purchase. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how many, look, and anybody worth their salt in cannabis leadership and planning already knows that it's a sector where you need to pivot really quickly, and you need to come up with different things and see what works really quickly and see what doesn't work. But I think this might be a thing that comes to be a long-lasting part of the industry in terms of home delivery.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's going to be here to stay. And like I said, if states don't already have it, I think they'll fast track that as a decent business play.
Yeah.
But yeah, looking at number 7 on this list, that New York Stock Exchange aims to boot Cantrust after concluding that the producer no longer is suitable for listing. And so I think the Canadian Stock Exchange is also going to drop them as well. So the regulatory enforcement arm has initiated the delisting process after concluding that the Canadian licensed producer is no longer suitable for listing. I think this maybe was the first instance of a delisting, whereas I think Agrimo Botanical or ASIN Industries up in Vancouver, BC, was the first to lose their license. We're now seeing kind of the next phase of that is being delisted. And I don't think they'll be the last one, as a lot of these companies are now penny stocks. They automatically don't qualify.
Right, right. I mean, look at, Aurora Cannabis as well. Yeah, I think it's Cantrust they've had long-term problems that they just haven't, I think, been able to fix. They've tried a couple of different measures, but yeah, I think they just got to a situation. Look, Cantrust also, all the problems they ran into last year was really kind of the start of the downturn in the industry. So it's interesting to see. I wouldn't call it an upturn in the industry right now, but COVID has boosted a lot of people's revenue. So it's interesting to see that now is the time that they really become that they get delisted. And look, it's a negative narrative, I think, from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's ironic at best that their name is Cantrust.
Yeah, that's funny. And they didn't even spell it right.
Right. Yeah. Number 6 on the list is that pot stocks are plunging after another round of disappointing earnings. Hexco dropped 20% after a large write-down. So MedPharm Labs fell as well after a net income of 1.9 million versus a net loss of 3.5 million. And Kronos also is going to report earnings. I think there was a $1 billion write-off from, was it Aurora that wrote $1 billion? Do you remember that?
I don't know if they wrote off $1 billion. I think that sounds right. Also, Kronos, they changed when they're reporting for auditing processes. So it will definitely be interested to see. A lot of people bearish on that stock right now, Kronos in particular. So it'll be interesting to see what numbers they do end up releasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if we can get enough written off from all the previous deals, there's a lot of write-downs that need to happen in order for those valuations to be more legitimate, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think some other companies also suffered from, heavy on the press release, heavy on the PR, heavy on the spin, some might call it, especially after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, write-downs are an issue. Capital is an issue. How much you want to be acquiring, that those things are going to come to fruition. I think that's also a big part of it. All the busted up and broken acquisitions that we've seen and the deals that have fallen apart. So yeah, there's it's definitely part of the industry to pay attention to and to really do your due diligence on, I think.
Yeah, Raymond James is a broker or an advisory firm. They're thinking that based on number 5 on this list is that Kronos is going to emerge from the crisis. So this particular analyst with Kronos is saying that coupled with the hitch in the company's U.S. businesses, it's not enough to trigger a target reduction, but that the stock is still looking attractive at these prices. I'm looking at a lot of these Canadian LPs, and they all are thinking that $1.74 is the necessary dollar amount required to break even on flower. So $1.74 per gram is incredibly high, especially if federal legalization happens in the US. That's going to put a lot of those companies out of business. So for companies in Canada that are thinking that $1.74 is the break even rate and yet still reducing their amount of production in Latin America is incongruous to me. It doesn't make sense why you would stop production in a cheap area like Latin America where labor is inexpensive and you can just silo your product. So really seems like an accounting gimmick to me to make your numbers look better, when the reality is if you cease production, that's going to have a long-term effect and catch up eventually.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think the other point I would just make about South America is I agree with you, but I think, excuse me, I think it's also, it will be interesting to see what happens in South America. I wonder if that was the right move for them at this point, because it is kind of such an unknowable part of the equation. But yeah, I mean, in general, I agree with you. I think the numbers that they're playing with, yeah, or I should say, I think they are playing a little bit with the numbers, but I think at the same time, they need to come up with those improvisations because of what kind of situation, they've gotten themselves into, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're going to have to mess around with it a little bit, but producing in Canada is not going to be cost efficient by comparison to Latin America. So when they stop making product in Latin America, it's a red flag to me that their productions aren't as efficient as they should be or could be. But
yeah, I think that's a fair takeaway. I think that's a fair takeaway.
But I'm with you. There's got to be some reasoning behind that, and then obviously time will tell. If in a couple of quarters they don't figure it out, then that stock price will probably catch up and drop as a result.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, look, there are some reasons to be bullish, but I think also at the same time, a lot of times where we've questioned some companies' decision making, I think usually we've seen a month or 2 months or a few months later, we've seen, oh, right, that didn't make any sense at the time. And now we're seeing, proof is in the pudding type of thing. I think the numbers always have to match up. They always have to make sense. So I think it can last for so long. But, look, it's interesting to see like what other catalysts happen there if they're able to come out of that. But definitely some cause for concern, I think, right now.
Well, number 4 on the list is that Champion Brands are bolstering a special advisory committee and shroom technical breakout charts. I'm going to skip this one as it doesn't really pertain to cannabis. So number 3 is that Hollister Biosciences closes a transformative venom extract acquisition, and they have a psychedelic deal up next. So Venom Extracts is going to bring with it a 2019 EBITDA of $2.5 million and revenues of $16.4 million, putting Hollister Biosciences on the fast track to becoming a cannabis industry leader in 2020 and diversifying into the world of psychedelics. So it seems to be a pretty popular trend to go from cannabis to shrooms or LSD or whatever else we're kind of seeing right now. It seems a little outside the norm to move to psychedelics. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's a little outside the norm. Also, it seems like the ecosystems are really different. I mean, the psychedelic industry seems more based around really a mental health type of focus, focusing on treating it really as entirely as a medicine in that regard. So it's interesting to see that pivot and to see what that's able to do for them. I think that they would, it's interesting to do it side by side. It's definitely interesting to see what plans they have in terms of pulling that off. I will be interested to see if they pull that off for sure.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but a lot of them are doing it. So we'll just have to see how that rolls out. Right. Number 2 on this list is that the FDA grants GW Pharma priority review for cannabidiol drug in seizure conditions. The status is usually granted to therapeutics that have given the potential to treat an illness that doesn't have an existing therapy. So a drug from GW Pharma targeting a cause of genetic epilepsy has received priority review status from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So while I'm not a fan of GW Pharma and Epidiolex, a friend of mine had multiple sclerosis. He's since passed away. He tried Epidiolex and some other medications, made him lethargic, made him really tired, didn't like it. So I'm not a fan of big pharma in general. I'm not a fan of synthetics in general. And so I wouldn't really go after GW Pharma, but a lot of people like the idea of getting FDA approval. Obviously, there's a lot of money behind that. So that exclusivity is going to probably help their stock price.
Right. I was going to say, I think if you're an investor in that company, you have to like that news. Sorry to hear about your friend. I had not heard those reactions to the drug, but I have not looked at all of the medical data on it. But in terms of the investing data, I mean, in terms of investing in GW Pharma, look, it's definitely, they're the leader, I mean, they just got FDA approval, even though they were expecting, people were expecting it. I think it's a pretty big deal in terms of giving, relevance and seriousness. And, the headline, I think, will just engage a whole slew of investors into what's going on there. So I think it lends credibility to the entire sector. So for that reason, I think it's a good thing. But look, I mean, the FDA needs to kind of, and is trying to figure out exactly what they're approving and what they're not. But I think that's a step in the right direction.
And then number one on this list is that there's a couple of companies that are turning LSD, magic mushrooms, ketamine, MDMA into the next blockbuster drug. But as we already mentioned, we're going to leave Bruce Linton off this list until he can actually generate some revenue. So I wanted to ask you about something you had mentioned earlier with Curaleaf. They've made a couple of non-arm's length deals to the tune of 800 million, 900 million, like just right below that red flag number of $1 billion. And some of those individuals were previous business partners or employees. And so I'm just curious if there's going to be some fallout from that in the eventuality that their stock goes down and shareholders get upset and sue them, if there's some credibility to how do I want to put this? I want to know if there's going to be some fallout and liability from the lack of due diligence or maybe just making a deal that shouldn't have been done.
Right. Are you which are you talking about specifically? The grassroots?
So there was so Curaleaf had bought out a California company and an Oregon company. Select Oils went for 900 million, and there was some people that were involved that there just wasn't an arm's length deal, I think. And so ultimately, looking at that almost $1 billion mark, I'm not sure if there's a true valuation there or not. So I'm expecting some lawsuits as a result of it.
Right. I mean, I just interviewed their chief marketing officer, who came from Select, actually, who has extensive background in the CPG industry, which I think is great for them. Mm-hmm. Also, when I interviewed him, I mean, a lot of I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the comments I got were from investors saying that very thing, that they were concerned about the deals that they had done and how much had been spent doing those deals. I don't know. I mean, I think the synergy between Select and Curaleaf, to me, makes sense. They want to be one of the major, if not the major, CPG cannabis companies in the States. They're expanding their footprint right now. They're trying to get into the major West Coast markets. They're trying to get into the major East Coast markets, trying to get into the major Midwest markets. I also think in terms of how much cash they have on the books, it seems like they may be able to pull that off. At the same time, the state of the industry, the state of the economy, the state of the world is such that I think it's impossible to know, because I think while those deals would have paid for themselves, I do think that in this environment, I think it's impossible to predict the success of those deals and how much the new product rollouts are going to matter, how much the retail space and the expansion there is going to come back to bite them in terms of how much money they're laying out and how much money they're making back. I know they've seen record revenue since the outbreak. But again, with, record job loss, record unemployment, what are we going to see from consumers in terms of cannabis? Will it become a toilet paper stock, a vice stock, cigarettes and alcohol? People will always be buying, or some people won't. I think something else that's interesting that I've been thinking about is, and this is interesting for a company like Curaleaf, bringing in new consumers, bringing in new customers at this time. I think the state of people's minds are such that they need some kind of thing that they haven't reached for yet to help calm them, to soothe their anxiety, to let them escape a little bit at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, what have you. So I think that will be bringing in new customers. I also know that they're working on these innovative products like nano emulsion gummies. I think also something that's interesting to talk about is just the cannabis 2.0, like edibles and tinctures and oils, and instead of the flower, especially with COVID being a respiratory illness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they have some exciting products coming out in that regard. So I'm interested to see, because I do think that they've absorbed some interesting brands and that have proven themselves to be really successful nationwide. So, and Curaleaf also has a successful kind of model going. I hear what people are saying. I'm interested to see if they can pull it off. I kind of was bullish on them before COVID. I think it's impossible to know what exactly COVID is going to mean for the industry, but I like a lot of things that they're doing in terms of making cannabis CPG and trying to make it big, but keep those brands kind of still a part of the ecosystem as they were when they absorbed them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as long as they can keep the SEC and the FDA and any other government agency off their back, there could be a significant gain. Like you were mentioning, the whole vice stocks or sin stocks have seen an inverse relationship to the overall market. You could go back to 2010 and see that, as well as any other economic downturn. So there is some benefits in being in gaming, gambling, tobacco, alcohol, cannabis. All of these companies have an opportunity to do well because people are looking for that anti-anxiety. I think CBD could actually be the gateway into new markets as people look for ways to alleviate some of that stress and anxiety. We've seen in France and Greenland, where they've banned the sale of alcohol. Specifically, I think Greenland said for children's abuse, I guess child abuse is like 33% in that country. And then in France, they said that they don't want people at home with kids drinking. I mean, that's a huge statement to make. And I think that in those markets, cannabis, or at least CBD, could get a lot more traction and then open up that medical and then open up that rec and then legalize it nationally. So, I mean, that could even happen in the US, looking at the tax revenues and essential business and all of these things that, is really coming quickly could change everything.
I agree. I think I saw something that Wawa was giving away CBD jellies today, or gummies today, or maybe it was yesterday, for free for the first however many customers. Insane. This is a way to relax, and we're not saying it cures anything, but I definitely think CBD is, look, we've seen it also in the sector. I mean, the proliferation of CBD in general, and then all the products that are on the marketplace, I think that really opened people's eyes to cannabinoids and normalized it to a large degree, and was part of what allowed cannabis to become such, a bigger industry that it's become. And I think it's also changed legislative minds. I think they kind of go hand in hand in terms of what the THC market is able to do for the CBD market, and vice versa. So I definitely think that they push each other and they complement each other. I also think some people that aren't looking to take THC right now for whatever reason, I think are probably going the CBD route as well.
Yeah, not price, but the product, the consumer behavior around purchasing is interesting right now with product preferences. So they've gone away from pre-rolls, which were like the number one SKU. Obviously, concentrates were increasing in popularity. Flower was the dominant category, but I think we're seeing people buy bulk ounces and just storing that away and really not smoking. Like you mentioned with edibles, Canada's 2.0 launching, you're seeing a lot of interest in those products. And so, during this time of anxiety, I think you're going to see a lot of CBD and THC products, edibles, selling a lot more as people are kind of worried about the lung issues as it pertains to this virus. So it could be a huge shift that could last indefinitely, or just an interesting trend that will be in the forever footnotes of this section as we look at data in the future. It's going to be an interesting point in time.
I could not agree more. I think it's a scary time, but in terms of looking at things and analyzing people, the market and psychology of the economy, I mean, that part of it is really fascinating and I think really interesting to see what happens with that for sure.
Definitely. Scary time, but for data nerds, it is interesting. So it's going to be fascinating to look at this for sure.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I want to thank my guest, Rena Sherbill. She is the senior editor with Seeking Alpha, as well as the host of the Cannabis Investing podcast. How can people get a hold of you?
Well, you can find us on anywhere you listen to podcasts, really, Stitcher, iTunes, Google Podcasts, but you can also just find us on Seeking Alpha, seekingalpha.com, and just the Cannabis Investing Podcast. You can check us out there. We're also on Twitter at CanPod1. So we'd love to hear from you and love to have new listeners. And thanks so much for having me on today, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I am Josh Kincaid. This is The Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out. Did you still have time for another one?
Yeah, let's do it.